I was reading the news about an incident that occurred just last month in March 2025 on the South African Sanae IV base in Antarctica. A member was alleged to have threatened and assaulted a fellow scientist and continued to do so despite interventions from his employers in South Africa. Eventually, he was persuaded to have therapy until he could be removed. It got me thinking of the isolated nature of such a place. People who might not know each other, living in close quarters for months at a time, and what happens if things ever do go wrong. It's a continent with no police, no society, and no emergency services. You're basically on your own, especially during the winter months. This rabbit hole led me to the unsolved case of Rodney Marks, who passed away in extremely mysterious circumstances. At first it seems like a freakish tragedy, but when Rodney Marks' body was finally flown back to New Zealand months later, an autopsy raised some shocking questions. Some people thought it was a natural death, but others believed that something more sinister had gone down at the Antarctic base. Hello and welcome. If you enjoy my videos, please be sure to subscribe, like, and comment. I'm also on Ko-fi and Buy Me a Coffee in case you want to show me some support. I was blown away by the kind comments on my last video. Thank you so much for that. Whether you're a new listener or have tuned in before, this is a welcoming space for all, where we look at the darker side of the world that we share. Now, let's lift the thin veil. Rodney Marks was born on March 13, 1968 in Geelong, Victoria, where he grew up with his two sisters. He had a typical Australian childhood, into footy, surfing, and music, especially as alternative culture took off in the 90s. Friends described him as sharp, curious, and always full of questions. That drive earned him a scholarship to a top private school, where his interest in science began to take shape. He went on to earn a bachelor's degree in astronomy from the University of Melbourne, graduating with first-class honours, then completed a PhD in physics at the University of New South Wales. His research focused on the South Pole's atmosphere and its value for astrophysical study. But Rodney didn't want to just write about Antarctica. After finishing his doctorate, he took a job there, in one of the most remote places on Earth. Most people heading to Antarctica first land in McMurdo, a research station that is considered to be the continent's only functioning town. It's a little outpost on the southernmost tip of Ross Island, perched where ice meets the Southern Ocean. Arriving in McMurdo is jarring. The 8-hour flight from New Zealand on a loud, freezing military cargo plane leaves you sore and half deaf. And the sensory shock doesn't stop there. Everything is white, blinding, surreal. There's a volcano smoldering in one direction, icy mountains in another, and snow stretching forever. If you've seen Star Wars, it's described as the planet Hoth. About 1,000 miles inland at the bottom of the world, 90 degrees south, the Amundsen Research Station sits on a sheet of ice kilometers wide, just a stone's throw away from the ever-shifting South Pole marker. It's the most isolated place humans live. Named after two explorers who first reached the pole in the early 1900s, the base to this day is run by the US National Science Foundation. The US built it in 1955 during the Cold War, initially as a strategic military position under Operation Deep Freeze, but later, this place would be dedicated to science. The dome, where Rodney would eventually live, went up in 1975 to replace the original station. Inside a massive geodesic shell designed to block the violent winds are 3 red 2-story structures, stacked like shipping containers, each with freezer-thick doors to hold back the cold. Between 1977 and 1998, Rodney spent his first winter at the Amundsen South Pole Station. There, he worked with the Center for Astrophysical Research in Antarctica. He was part of the South Pole Infrared Explorer Project, or SPIREX, which aimed to study the stars using infrared telescopes, taking advantage of the South Pole's clear, dry skies to gather data about the structure and age of our galaxy. Rodney found the work deeply engaging. He was genuinely fascinated by the research and seemed to thrive in the unique challenges the South Pole presented. Staying the winter months from February to October is colloquially known as winter overing, and at the Amundsen Station, it comes with significant trade-offs. It's a time when the station becomes completely cut off from the rest of the world. During those months, the South Pole sees almost no daylight at all. Temperatures routinely plunge between -31 and -170 degrees Fahrenheit, and conditions are too severe for planes to come or go. Once the last aircraft leaves at the start of the winter season, those who remain are committed until the following spring, no matter what happens. Those who end up staying understand that there will be an extreme isolation, with even essentials like medical transportation not being an option. The next transportation in and out of Amundsen Scott can only start in summer, which begins in October. The winter crew at Amundsen Scott in the early 2000s was kept small, usually around 50 people, who were responsible for keeping the station running. Rodney was quite happy with this arrangement. As someone who was very much into his work, the lifestyle suited him greatly. From November 1999 to November 2000, he decided to head to ASTRO, short for the Smithsonian Astrophysical Observatory, where he'd be responsible for running the observatory. With such a small population, it became a tight-knit community, and the group were known to frequent the base bar called Club 90 South. With not much else to do, especially during the endless winter, social life at Amundsen Scott pretty much revolved around drinking. Pallets of alcohol were flown alongside the scientific supplies at the start of the season. Beer, whiskey, tequila, you name it. There was a joke amongst the crew there that it was the norm to hand in your preferences for alcohol before your food, before every winter over. The station even had its own still, which was used to brew a moonshine they used to call toast juice, with the recipe passed from crew to crew. But it wasn't necessarily all cheery. It's often overlooked or underestimated what extreme isolation can do to the human mind. At least one person every year would hit the bottle a little too hard and lose their mind. In 1996, one guy ended up in detox 3 times before they finally moved him into the medical wing, just to keep him away from everyone else. But things in Antarctic isolation have gotten darker. In 2018, a researcher in another station was charged with attempted murder after getting drunk and trying to silence a fellow researcher who wouldn't quit spoiling the ends of books for him. When it came to Rodney's personal life, he often frequented Club 90 South, and those that knew him referred to him as an experienced drinker. Some said that he often did it to mask his Tourette's, but also to build relationships beyond the 10 scientists, which traditionally kept to themselves in one little clique, with the 40 maintenance staff forming another. The divide between the scientists and the contract workers is a long-standing one. One of his colleagues at the outpost later told the press, quote, "He had a PhD, and yet he would play poker, smoke cigarettes, and drink whiskey with the carpenters and plumbers," unquote. Rodney also loved his music. He started a band on the outpost called Fanny Pack and the Big Nancy Boys, and it was through this band he met the love of his life, Sonia. Sonia was a maintenance specialist at the base who had formed a deep bond with Rodney. Although it was commonplace for staff at the outpost to form temporary relationships during the winter months, it was different with Sonia and Rodney. They had decided that they would get married upon the end of their stay in Antarctica. But sadly, Rodney and Sonia wouldn't ever end up getting married. On May the 11th, 2000, Rodney decided to head from the remote observatory where he worked to the quarters where he lived to have dinner in the canteen with Sonia. To get to the base, he had to walk through an area called the Dark Sector, which was about 1 kilometer long. Based on my research, the Dark Sector is exactly what it sounds like, an area with no light, so the telescopes scientists like Rodney use don't get interference, and it's steeped in perpetual darkness. This is when he was hit by the first of his symptoms, which would last about 36 hours. Rodney's vision suddenly went blurry. When he arrived at the canteen, he told Sonia that he wasn't feeling well and that his eyes were irritating him. Although he did manage to finish his dinner, he figured he was extremely tired and decided to head to bed. But Rodney woke up several times throughout the night with pain all over his body, but he was still able to get back to sleep. He finally got up at 5:30 a.m. when he started to have trouble breathing. This was followed by vomiting blood. Rodney started to get extremely concerned and decided to check himself into the station's medical facility, where he was seen by the outpost doctor, Robert Thompson. Thompson noted that Rodney seemed, quote, nervous, anxious, and upset, unquote, and borderline delirious, but wrote off his symptoms as alcohol withdrawal. He was given an antipsychotic injection to calm him down and then sent back to continue his day. But over the next few hours, Rodney's condition got worse. Instead of keeping him under close observation, Dr. Thompson decided that keeping him distracted with work would be the best and let him go. As the day went on, Rodney felt severe pain in his abdomen and also started to feel dizzy. His blood pressure dropped, his breathing became even more labored, and he had pains all over his body, with his eyes being the most painful of all. The following morning, on May the 13th, he was unable to function without having sunglasses on. Rodney visited Dr. Thompson twice again that day, but the doctor was unsure of what else to do. The outpost didn't have the equipment to test Rodney further, and an emergency rescue was out of the question. Dr. Thompson decided it was best to give him another antipsychotic injection called Haldol, hoping it would help calm him down. This was apparently standard practice at the time for handling severe psychological distress or delirium. Sonia, who was in the room with him during his final few moments, said that Rodney's condition improved for a few minutes, but then he suddenly stopped breathing and started to crash. The outpost trauma team was called in, a mixed group of scientists and engineers with training in CPR, but not otherwise medically trained. They spent about an hour trying to resuscitate Rodney, but unfortunately, he passed away of heart failure at 6 p.m. in New Zealand time at just 32 years old, roughly 36 hours after he felt his first symptoms. No plane would arrive to pick up his cadaver for at least 5 more months. Now, under normal circumstances, if an otherwise healthy scientist working in a lab anywhere else in the world suddenly died, then there would be usually some kind of investigation, interviews would be held, items the scientist was in last contact with would be analyzed. But in this case, the National Science Foundation waited for none of that. Instead, they issued a statement that said Rodney had, quote, died of natural causes, unquote, which were believed to be due to his excessive alcohol consumption. The statement went on to say that there was nothing to suggest that the death was due to his work or any other toxic or infectious agent. It wasn't until the 30th of October that Rodney's cadaver was exhumed and transported to Christchurch, New Zealand. Before we get into what was actually found, it's worth clearing up how the law works in Antarctica, because, yeah, it's kind of a mess. The continent is governed by the Antarctic Treaty System, which basically says no military, no permanent residence, and the land is to be used strictly for peaceful, scientific purposes. Countries like the US, Russia, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, and others are part of this agreement. Now, some countries, including New Zealand, have claimed chunks of Antarctica, but those claims aren't recognized by the Antarctic Treaty. In this case, the Amundsen Scott is located on the landmass New Zealand claims as the Ross Dependency, but the US does not recognize this claim. So when it comes to law enforcement, things get unclear. Technically, people in Antarctica are subject to the laws of their home country. So, for example, if an Australian commits a crime down there, they'd normally be tried in an Australian court. But here's where things get blurry. In cases of crimes with multiple people from different countries, the country of the accused has to agree that a crime was actually committed and be willing to prosecute. If country A makes an allegation about the citizen of country B, but country B disagrees, or just doesn't want to deal with it, it gets complicated fast, and you'll see why that information is relevant to this case. Going back to Rodney, 6 weeks after his body was relocated to New Zealand, an autopsy confirmed that lethal traces of methanol were found in his body. Methanol was used to clean the telescopes Rodney was using, but the coroner said that the amount in Rodney's system was so high that he believed it was virtually certain to have been ingested. The amount was equivalent to a cup of wine, too much to ingest in any other way than drinking it, and due to this discovery, many people started to question whether or not this was a natural death. Another thing was that needle marks were found on his arms. Although Rodney did have a history in his youth of using harder drugs, and the outpost did have rumors of marijuana being grown in the vents, these were likely due to the antipsychotic injections given to him. And so based on these suspicious circumstances, an investigation spanning a decade began into the suspicious death of Rodney Marks, headed by Detective Senior Sergeant Grant Wormald of the New Zealand Police. Rodney wasn't known to have any enemies or people who hated him. The community living together in the winter months were known to be pretty tight-knit, and since there were less than 50 of them living there at the time, everyone's whereabouts were relatively well accounted for. All the staff who wintered over at the outpost went through rigorous physical and mental tests before they were allowed to stay. This made the chance that anyone in the outpost had killed Rodney a hard thing to claim, but it was not impossible. It was also suggested that Rodney could have taken his own life, but that theory came with several holes. Ingesting methanol is a terrible way to go. It takes a very long time and is very painful, and as a highly intelligent astrophysicist, Rodney would have at least had some knowledge of this. Additionally, according to those who knew him, Rodney had a lot going on for him in his career. He had a fiancée, and to repeat myself, he had gone through extremely rigorous psychological evaluations before he was allowed to winter over at the Amundsen Scott Research Station. An evaluation, whilst not foolproof, would have probably dug out any such intentions or struggles with mental health. Then, there's a matter that Rodney approached the doctor at the station, seeking treatment for his symptoms exactly 3 times, desperate for help. Generally speaking, people with thoughts like that wouldn't take those steps. Another theory explored whether Rodney's drinking habits crossed the line into addiction, compelling him to grab a bottle of methanol to satisfy his need. Some people have labeled him as a binge drinker, but I found conflicting statements on whether or not he was dependent on alcohol. He told the station doctor that he hadn't had a drink in nearly 2 days, and the toxicology reports later confirmed he had only trace amounts of alcohol in his system. Like the rest of the crew, he clearly enjoyed a drink. When his room was cleaned, multiple bottles of spirits were found. But why would he be desperate enough to drink methanol when safer options were within arm's reach? A fourth theory was that the methanol was simply consumed by accident. Rodney's work area was notoriously chaotic. His desk reportedly had nearly 20 bottles of various liquids scattered across it. While some were alcoholic beverages, others were chemicals like ethanol and methanol, both of which he used to maintain his telescopes. It's not outside the realms of imagination that he grabbed the wrong bottle. The final theory centers around a black bottle of exotic liquor with Portuguese writing and a prawn motif on its neck. Rodney had been seen with this bottle, which was reportedly given to him as a gift, but it couldn't be found by the investigation team. This raised the possibility of alcohol poisoning, and if that was the case, was it the result of poor quality distilling, or was the poisoning intentional? The investigation was made harder by the fact that a lot of items had been removed from Rodney's quarters and sanitized or destroyed and were never retrieved for analysis. Only a few items were later removed without much care for analysis, but anything that was deemed to have no meaning was either sanitized or destroyed. And after all was said and done, his room was given to other members of staff, which contaminated any potential forensic information. However Rodney ingested the methanol, one thing was known. Dr. Thompson had not conducted any analysis of Rodney's blood while he was alive. In fact, the machine used for such analysis, a Kodak Ektachem blood analysis machine, didn't even have the required battery to function. This had been reported to the facilities management company, which was none other than Raytheon Polar Services, a subsidiary of a large American defense contractor called Raytheon. But for some reason, the issue was never resolved. If this diagnosis had been done, there's a high chance that Rodney could have had his symptoms counteracted by regular spirits, which were available in large quantities, as the ethyl alcohol in spirits can counteract methanol poisoning in a medically supervised environment. Little did Detective Wormald know that getting to the bottom of what happened would prove next to impossible. As the multiple-year investigation kicked off in 2002, he tried to reach out to the U.S. Department of Justice for information on the full list of 49 individuals that were based in the outpost, but was told to approach NSF and Raytheon Polar Services. Both times, his request was rejected. In fact, the NSF even made complaints about the New Zealand authorities getting involved, claiming that the investigation was not within their jurisdiction. Okay, so far, although that sounds frustrating, one could argue that it's pretty on par with companies trying to protect their privacy and not cooperating where they aren't legally obligated to. But here is where it starts to get odd. It was eventually discovered that the US authorities had already conducted their own investigation, but when the case files were requested by the authorities in New Zealand, they rejected to share anything. Instead, the NSF sent them a bunch of unhelpful memos, which were mostly redacted. It's not explained why the National Science Foundation was stonewalling foreign authorities, but it only got weirder as Detective Wormald started to dig deeper. Because of the NSF's evasiveness about the 49 staff members, Detective Wormald decided to take it upon himself to gather information on them firsthand. Because these people lived all over the world, instead of trying to track them down in person, he tracked them down online and decided to create a questionnaire to send to them. And although finally in 2006 the NSF did agree to send this questionnaire to the staff, They would only do so on the condition that they were allowed to approve the questions themselves. When Wormald reluctantly agreed to let them do it, and the NSF eventually did send it to the staff, they chose to emphasize very clearly that answering the questionnaire was not mandatory, effectively discouraging potential witnesses from participating by allegedly threatening their employment. At the end of it all, Detective Wormald received responses from just 13 people who were willing to cooperate with him. The rest chose not to. Most key witnesses did not respond. In 2006, the Coroner's Court in New Zealand reconvened for an inquest where all the theories were proposed, and it was determined that it was highly unlikely that Rodney Marks had taken his own life or that it was a prank gone wrong. Detective Wormald said the black liquor bottle could have been a vital clue behind Rodney's death, and in order to rule out any foul play, it would need to be materialized. Although the 13 people who did come forward said they knew of no such bottle, Detective Wormald claims that several people who were at the base with Rodney have anonymously come forward and acknowledged its existence, and so murder could not be ruled out. During the inquest, Dr. Robert Thompson was initially cooperative, but he disappeared suddenly and cut off all contact before the inquest could be completed. His actions were scrutinized by Dr. William Silva, who was working on an Antarctic base nearby at the time of Rodney's death. Dr. Silva said the use of antipsychotic medicine without checking the liver could have triggered the final cardiac arrest in Rodney, but he had no way to prove this without a blood report from the Ectochem machine. In 2008, Rodney's family stated they've lost hope that the case will ever be solved. The investigation into Rodney Marks' death was stonewalled almost from the start, and much of that resistance comes from the very institution overseeing the station. Rodney is the only person who is known to have died under mysterious circumstances in the South Pole. Whether or not this was an intentional or accidental poisoning or just pure negligence, many believe the NSF, a publicly funded institution, may have kept the truth under wraps to protect its reputation. For an organization that prides itself on scientific achievement, being associated with rampant alcohol and drug abuse, misconduct, or even criminal activity at one of its premier research facilities would be a devastating blow. The truth is, we might never know why they refuse to cooperate, but that silence may speak louder than any official statement. One thing we do know for certain is that the New Zealand authorities have still not closed this investigation, nearly 25 years later, and the case remains unsolved. Thank you for listening. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel and you like and you comment. Until next time.